get going with our event. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the chair of the criminal law section of the Florida Bar, Jennifer Zadalis, our chair-elect, Warren Lindsay, Jenny Dormany, our program administrator with whom we could not live without, our CLE and membership committees, and of course, on behalf of the community of over 2,100 prosecutors, defenders, public and private, judges, and legal educators, welcome to this special CLE event we have for you, obtaining CARES Act relief funds, and of course, preparing for the federal oversight, which will naturally come with that funding. It's part of our series of free CLE COVID-19 related programming. My name is Scott Fingerhut. I am the CLE chair for the section. Before we begin, a couple brief housekeeping matters that we usually go through. Number one, kindly keep your audio and video turned off. Our speakers will be presenting today by audio only. You see their PowerPoint up on the screen. Zoom hasn't really found a way for us to prohibit everyone from annotating on other people's exhibits. Probably going to be a court issue as well until Zoom fixes that. So please hold yourself back from drawing or highlighting on our speaker's PowerPoint. If you have not done so already, to enhance your CLE experience, we would recommend if you go to your video settings, enable your HD function. It's the first box beneath your image. We suggest you also click hide all non-video participants. That'll get rid of everyone on the screen except the PowerPoint. And then from there you could choose which view you prefer, but really whether gallery or speaker, the only thing you'll be seeing except this face when I pop back up at the end is the PowerPoint. Second housekeeping matter. If for some reason we get Zoom bombed with unsavory stuff, we're just going to shut everything down and then everybody log back on, and we'll hope that the Zoom bombers will have had their fun and moved elsewhere. 3, we will take live questions from you during the presentation. How do you get them to us? Email them either to Jenny Dormany, whose email you have. She's been sending you the invites, and also the supplemental reading material, the articles from our presenters, which was sent out to you today. Or you could email me directly at AOL. Sorry, it's hsfpa@aol.com. We'll forward them right to our presenters for consideration for bringing up during the presentation. Housekeeping matter number 4. Our course number, CLE 3974, 3974. And as always, right after this program, Jenny will email you not only the link to the video of this recording, which you can watch again, keep on learning from, and pass on to other folks you think may be interested. And she will also email you the accreditation sheet for your CLE credits for this event. Last housekeeping matter. If you're not a member of the criminal law section already, join our section. It's only $25. It's a chance for you to learn a lot and to give back a lot through CLE, through writing articles for us, impact your criminal justice system. It's a chance to really make a difference. Our website is Florida Bar CLS for criminallawsection.org. Okay, let me introduce our presenters briefly to you. Their full bios are attached to the invitation and the advertisement for this CLE. All experts, all part of the great law firm Squire Patton Boggs, which is a full-service international law firm, 45 offices spread out over 20 countries all over the world. In alphabetical order with us today, we're lucky to have Leah Brownlee, who is of counsel in the corporate practice group. She works out of Cleveland, Ohio. Second is Margaret Daum. She's a partner in the public policy practice group. She's out of Washington, D.C., and she's the former staff director of the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. That's number two. Number three is Clark Irvin. Clark is a partner in the Government Investigations and White Collar Practice Group out of DC. He is the former Inspector General of both the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State. And last but not least, our panelist and also moderator for today's program, Kevin McCart, also a partner in the Government Investigations and White Collar Practice Group, also working out of DC. So with that, my video gets turned off. Mr. McCart, take it away.
Today, and just to give you a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going. First, Leah will step through a number of the CARES Act funding sources that are out there, including the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, Main Street Lending Program, and the Employee Retention Tax Credit, including how to obtain funds and, importantly, where possible, how to obtain loan forgiveness so that those funds don't need to be repaid. Next, we'll discuss the various oversight mechanisms in place to scrutinize the use of CARES Act funding. And really, these fall largely into four primary buckets. And those are mechanisms that were created by the CARES Act or in other manners, but in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The second is pre-existing agencies or mechanisms, but those that have been invigorated by the CARES Act, such as by receiving additional funding to perform CARES Act related oversight. Third, pre-existing agencies who have regulatory oversight of businesses that handle federal funds, such as banking regulators, or whose business as usual oversight role intersects with the receipt and use of federal funding. So that could be things such as DOJ or the standing congressional committees. And then fourth and finally, private litigants. We'll then touch on the lessons that can be learned from previous large-scale outlays of federal funds and how those lessons can guide your COVID-related preparations. Finally, we'll discuss proactive steps you can take when applying for, accepting, deploying, and tracking federal funds, including examples of questions that we're seeing clients wrestle with and what we think are probably some of the best practices that they've adopted to address those questions. Before I turn it over to Leah to jump into the substance of the presentation, I wanted to make one final introductory point, which is, these are massive programs, and Leah will talk through, some of the scale of that. But with that, comes oversight and scrutiny, and that oversight and scrutiny that we'll talk about in some detail today is not theoretical, and it's not even just likely. It's already underway, and in fact, the various agencies and committees and organizations are feeding off of each other. Media reports and private lawsuits have spawned letters from members of Congress to banks asking for more information on how they prioritize PPP loan applications. Congress has reached out to a whole host of folks. It's also requested action by federal agencies such as HHS, DHS, and the SBA, and particularly the IGs within those organizations. And those IG investigations are up and running, and DOJ is already contacting banks and borrowers. The SEC is getting in on the action as well, looking at disclosures that were made by PPP loan recipients to try to match them up to see if they were being candid with their investors about their financial position. As Margaret will discuss, the Congressional Oversight Commission, which isn't even fully constituted yet, has made oversight requests and issued a report, even though they don't have a chairperson. And on top of that, the Treasury and the SBA have committed to auditing all loan forgiveness applications for PPP loans for $2 million or more. And so we'll talk a fair bit about the PPP throughout today's presentation, because it's sort of the most robust and mature of these programs, because it's been out and operational for the longest. But certainly this scrutiny is not limited in any way to the PPP. You know, we're seeing oversight underway regarding funding for the airline industry, higher education, and healthcare providers as well, just to name a few. And so this ever-changing landscape put organizations really in limbo. They need and want funds, but aren't sure they can take the chance of the political winds changing and putting them at risk. And finally, the last thing I'll note as sort of a preliminary matter is that critically, while the oversight is starting now, it will continue for years and will be greatly influenced, as it's already been, by the shifting political winds. And therefore, it's vital that organizations take steps now to insulate themselves from what will be a protracted period of scrutiny. With that, I'll now turn it over to Leah to talk through the various sources of CARES Act funds.
Thank you, Kevin. And as Kevin introduced, I'm going to touch on a few of the programs, but I won't be touching on items such as the airline programs, but the more generally applicable ones. So starting with the Paycheck Protection Program, also with the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, and then another program that hasn't yet started accepting applications is the Main Street Lending Program, and then we have, a supplement also on the tax side with the Employee Retention Tax Credit. So I'll dive in right at the front with the Paycheck Protection Program, which is the one that's been all over the news, and everybody's probably very familiar with it so far. So Kevin, can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So I want to say first off, everybody's very familiar with the Paycheck Protection Program and a lot of the rules that have been set for the last couple of months since it was rolled out. That being said, this morning the Congress passed the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act, and it's expected that the Senate will look at it next week. This act is supposed to fix some problems that have been seen in the Paycheck Protection Program. And so I'll reference some of the changes that have gone through Congress as I'm going through the slides and what's being recommended. And we can probably expect to see the law change with regard to some of these numbers prior to June 30th, I would expect. So first off, Paycheck Protection Program loan eligibility. This has kind of splashed all over the news. The big bucket is 500 or fewer employees. If you have more, you may still be eligible if you fit into one of the SBA employee-based standards for your industry. Or you may also be eligible if you meet some financial guidelines with the tangible net worth. Also, and clearly less than 500, but not a corporation, sole proprietors, independent contractors, and self-employed people are eligible. So that first eligibility bucket. Next, you have to make sure that you fit under the affiliation rules from the SBA, and that, in essence, says that anybody who controls you as a company or has controlling votes, and we see this a lot in the venture area, if they control other companies or have controlling votes, that when all of those are aggregated together, the number of employees or the test that you fall under isn't exceeded. Also, 501c3 applicants, tax-exempt veterans organizations, tribal businesses. And most importantly, your business was in business on February 15th of this year, and you had employees that you paid salaries to or you paid yourself. And So let's move to the next slide. So if you meet those qualification criteria, you go to your bank. A lot of you may have already gone to your bank, or you have clients that have gone to the bank. That being said, there are still loan funds available. As of May 21st, of the $660 billion that had been allocated under this program, only $512 billion had been spent. So that leaves about $150 billion remaining today. So it's still open. Banks are still taking applications. And it seems that the urgency has gone down. And so it actually might be easier to get an application in today than it was in the first couple of weeks. So you go complete your loan application. You have to have payroll documentation that backs up how much your loan request is for. And when you make those applications, you make certain certifications. So that first certification I'm highlighting because this has been all over the news as far as what Treasury is going to look at if they do their audit for loans over $2 million. It's been why a lot of companies are returning funds, and that is the certification that the uncertainty of the economic conditions makes the loan request necessary to support ongoing operations for your business. The next certification is that you're going to use your loan proceeds to retain workers and maintain payroll and make other qualifying payments, that you don't have a duplicative loan pending. And that covers 3 and 4. It's just 2 different certifications covering it. So go to the next slide, please. So you're comfortable with everything. You need the money. How much can you get? Pretty basic equation, 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs incurred during the year prior to the loan date. So we're not looking at 2019 as a calendar year, but if you're applying today, you're probably looking at, mid-May 2019 to mid-May 2020, and looking at that as your 1-year period. So you take your included payroll costs, which are salaries, wages, commissions, bonuses, leave pay, healthcare benefit costs, retirement benefit costs, separation pay, lump that all together. And then you deduct your excluded payroll costs, which is on the next slide, if you skip over there. And so excluded costs are going to be costs for employees that have salaries in excess of $100,000. And so with regard to those employees, you're only going to claim their salary up to $100,000. Note that you are going to still, over that $100,000 cap, claim all of the other benefits, the health care, the retirement, etc. You're going to take away the cost for employees that live outside the U.S. And so to figure out if they live outside the U.S., we're going to look at an IRS rule, but in essence, where do you issue their paycheck to? What is the address on their W-2? That's a really good indication if they are in the U.S. And you're going to take out, payroll taxes, income taxes, qualified sick leave, which you're already receiving credit. So no double dipping. If you got a credit under the Families vs. Coronavirus Response Act, you're not going to get that as a payroll cost. So you skip down from there to the next slide. And we figured out how much your payroll costs were. You take away your excluded payroll costs and you get your loan amount. So take that loan amount, maybe it's $100,000, and you apply it over the next 8 weeks, and this is how the rules work today, to qualifying costs. And depending on what that breakdown is, depends on how much of your loan you can apply to be forgiven. And there will be a forgiveness application. So you can get up to 100% of the loan forgiven. And as I said, today we're looking at an 8-week period. The bill that passed in the House this morning would extend that 8-week period to 24 weeks. Notably, though, last Friday, the Senate was looking at a bill that looked at 16 weeks. So we know that it's probably going to get extended, and we're going to know what the new extended period is within the next couple of weeks from now. And you're going to apply the loan you got. 75% of that needs to be payroll costs. We use the same definition as before, and 25% of the forgiveness amount can be interest on your mortgage, your rent payment, your utility payment, or interest on other debt obligations. All of those have to be relating to contracts that you signed before February 15th, 2020. And, you know, notably, it can be 90% payroll, 10% of the other amount. There is also a change to this that looks like it's coming down the pipe. Congress had moved this split to 60-40 in the bill that they passed this morning. So we will see if this split changes some. So let's go to the next slide. And I'm not going to go through this in much detail since we have a lot of other things to talk about, but there's a calculation to figure out your forgiveness, because notably, while we're saying you pay employees, you might not have the same number of employees during the 8-week period after you receive the funds as you did during the year period that you were looking at. And so we have some optionality for how to do the calculation. Additionally, a lot of companies reduced salaries when the coronavirus hit. And so we also have a reduction based on reduction of salary. So if it's more than a 25% reduction, it can reduce your amount of forgiveness. So let's go to the next slide. But there's some caveats to this. If you reduced your number of employees, you fired people originally, and now you're worried that you're not going to be able to get your entire amount of your loan forgiven, you can rehire those employees. And if you do so by June 30th, it will not be counted against you. Some other things to note, though. One, it doesn't have to be the same employee that's rehired. But if you did fire somebody and you gave them a good faith written offer to rehire them that was declined, that termination won't count against you. If you fired somebody for cause or they quit voluntarily, that also won't be counted against you. And then also, when I said you reduce the wages, if you increase the wages, that won't be counted against you. So then once you figure out this pretty complicated equation of how much, you figured out how much you can borrow, you got the money, you figured out how much can be forgiven, and you tried to modify your business practices so that you can get as much forgiven as possible. Now you're past your 8-week period and you want to request loan forgiveness. So there is a form loan forgiveness application that has been published, and it has some calculations and worksheets that can be viewed online. We can send around links after as well. There is on this forgiveness application a checkbox. So if you received a loan in excess of $2 million, you check the box. And if you plus all of your affiliates, so you go back to that SBA affiliation rule and you look at all those other companies that are related to you by control and count up the total of the amount of money. If that's more than $2 million, everybody checks the box in that affiliate group. And then the lender is supposed to make a decision on forgiveness within 60 days. Notably, not on the slide is that after that 60-day period, the SBA then has 90 days. So that's an additional note. And then a couple things on taxes. Usually loans or traditional loans when forgiven are income to companies, but under the terms of the CARES Act, the PPP loan will not be income when it is forgiven. Based on that, the IRS has come out with guidance that says that any payments made with the forgiven funds are not tax deductible. Let's go to the next slide. So the loan terms, if you get the PPP loan, but not 100% is forgiven, which is, very common, and I would say probably 80% or so of the clients that I'm talking to are not going to get 100% forgiveness. They're going to repay the rest of the loan. So today, those loan terms are 1% interest, 2 years from the funding of the loan, with no penalty for prepayment, and the payments are deferred for 6 months. Notably, the bill that was passed by Congress would change that 2-year term to 5 years. And we don't know yet, once that rolls out, how that's going to affect the actual loan documents that are signed with the lenders. Because if you got a loan from Citibank, you have a promissory note from Citibank that tells you how to repay it to Citibank. So it's possible that those loan documents will have to be modified if Congress changes the repayment timing. So let's go to the next slide. So that was the quick and dirty on the PPP, and there'll be a lot more discussion about PPP later. But the next one, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. I'm going to do this one really quick because a lot of things have changed with the availability of funds under this program. So there's still funds available. However, at this time, only agricultural business applications are being accepted. You apply for it through the SBA's website because the EIDL is not a new program. It's just being applied in the coronavirus situation. So if you are an agricultural business, you can apply today. If you submitted an application previously, it was open to all businesses that met the other qualification rules. The loan proceeds can be used for working capital. It cannot be used for refinancing debt. And if you get both the EIDL and the PPP, they cannot be used for the same purposes. So let's go to the next slide. A correction on this slide. So a couple things on loan parameters. It says up to $2 million. That was the original amount of the loan when the loan program opened. Today, because of the popularity and trying to reserve funds, the maximum loan amounts are now $150,000. There is interest on these loans that's higher than the PPP. It's 3.75% for businesses and 2.75% for nonprofits. The term is up to 30 years, and payments are deferred for 1 year. The borrower does not have to prove they could not get credit elsewhere. And there will be collateral requirements for loans in excess of $25,000. One thing that's been kind of all over the news on this program was the emergency grant. And this was a grant, and it still is for an agricultural business, of up to $10,000 within 3 days of the application. So it was a grant, no obligation to repay, that would be made immediately. A caveat to this is while there is no obligation to repay it, if you also received a PPP loan, when you're doing your forgiveness application calculation, you would subtract the amount of the emergency grant that you received from the forgiveness amount that you qualified for. And again, the loans cannot be for the same purpose for EIDL and PPP. So that's a kind of a standard that's going throughout. Everything is no double dipping. So whether it's the IRS or SBA or Congress saying they're trying to make sure every loan and every credit is for a different purpose. So let's go to the next slide. Just a really quick note on the Main Street Lending Program. This has not started yet, but there is guidance on what it will look like. Businesses that were established before March 13th, 2020 will be eligible. No more than 15,000 employees in 2019 with annual revenues of no more than $5 billion. So it is different and for more mid-sized businesses than the PPP. That being said, there are a lot of businesses that may be eligible for both the PPP and the Main Street Lending, and they can apply and receive both. Also, this is for U.S. businesses, so it has to be an established business in the U.S. with majority of the employees in the U.S. This is through lenders only. Lenders are qualifying to be able to give Main Street Lending loans, and so there won't be separate applications that we see with the PPP to other kind of non-lender facilities. And there'll be similarly, a number of certifications that need to be made under this loan. Some of the important ones are no stock repurchase. There's going to be compensation caps and restrictions on issuing dividends for a year. Unlike the PPP loan, you have to certify that you can meet your financial obligations for the next 90 days, not that this loan is absolutely necessary for your business to continue. And that's me commenting a little bit on the PPP certification. So, and then, the other things is you can't prepay other loans. Basically, the Main Street loan stands first in the line of your creditors to get paid until it is repaid. You also may not cancel or reduce your other lines of credit. So let's go to the next slide. So just this slide just shows a table of some of the terms for the Main Street Lending Program. The most important part is that maximum loan size. This is to see if you even do qualify. So you have to run this calculation, and I would say this is where you've determined whether or not you're going to be able to even go to your bank and start talking about getting this loan, is if you have a maximum loan size that's large enough that it's worth having those discussions when you do the calculation. So let's go to the next slide. And this is the last one that I'm going to talk about. And this is a tax item. It's employee retention tax credit. It's different than PPP in that, it's different and the same in that you're retaining employees and you're giving money back to businesses. This, however, requires businesses to have revenue. So one of the qualifications is that you have a significant decline in gross receipts. And so for our R&D businesses out there that are pre-revenue, or businesses that really haven't been hit as hard as they expected from COVID-19, they may not be qualified to take this tax credit. The tax credit is also only up to 50% of qualified wages paid to employees. Qualified wages, if you have 100 full-time employees in 2019 or fewer, is going to be wages paid during suspension of operations or during a period where you're experiencing the decline in gross receipts. If you had more than 100 full-time employees, it's wages paid during the time that you're not providing services. So you've closed down because of COVID-19 and you continue to pay wages. And then you get up to $5,000 per employee. So for each employee, because you get 50%, you have to pay at least $10,000. And you can get the credits in real time rather than waiting for the tax deadline. And you can do that by filing a Form 7200. I think we're moving on. Oh, I have a couple more slides, sorry. Note, you cannot do both ERTC and a PPP loan. Your credit will be recaptured if you get a PPP loan. Your wages that you're counting, and this is the no double dipping. So if you got a tax credit for paid family and sick leave, you cannot count the wages used for that tax credit. And also, if you're accessing one of the work opportunity tax credits by co-sharing employees, you cannot use that employee or that tax credit received for the same purposes. So I believe that's the end of my slide.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Leah. Clark Irvin here. So as Kevin said right at the outset, the CARES Act established some new oversight mechanisms, both Inspector General oriented ones and congressional ones, and those are on top of existing oversight mechanisms. I, as a former Inspector General, as you heard, of the State Department and Homeland Security Department, I'm going to talk about the two new Inspector General oversight mechanisms that have been created by the CARES Act. The first of them is the creation of a new Office of Inspector General within the Treasury Department. There is already, of course, an Inspector General for the Treasury Department itself. The IRS, of course, is a component of the Treasury Department, so there is a separate Inspector General just for the IRS. And now there's a third one, and that is called the Special Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery. To talk for a second about the mandate of this new Special Inspector General, if you look at the statute, the mandate is to conduct, supervise, and coordinate audits and investigations regarding the making, purchase, management, and sale of loans, loan guarantees, and other investments by the Secretary of the Treasury under the CARES Act, and the management by the Secretary of any program under that act. One might be tempted to read that language literally, and if you do, then you see that it focuses solely on the government's role in the distribution and management of CARES Act funds, specifically the Treasury Secretaries. But I think that that would be too literal and narrow a reading of a law. In overseeing how the Treasury Secretary administers the program, as a practical matter, it seems to us that the Special Inspector General will also necessarily look at the recipients of these loans, and he will no doubt be auditing and investigating in due course whether the recipients are legally entitled to receive the funds and whether they are spending them for their intended purpose and otherwise in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. What are the powers and responsibilities of this new Special Inspector General? I would divide that into two buckets. One is traditional powers that all inspectors general have, at least of larger agencies like Treasury, and then some special ones that are intended further to enhance the independence and aggressiveness of this new Special Inspector General. So in the traditional bucket, I would note a number of things. First, the Special Inspector General is appointed by the President, nominated by the President, and has to be confirmed by the Senate. That's intended to give him, and in this case it is a him, about whom more later, additional heft and authority. The Office of the Special Inspector General is an independent federal investigative and law enforcement body with broad authority to undertake audits and investigations that the Inspector General deems to be warranted without first seeking and obtaining the approval of the Treasury Secretary. Among those powers is the subpoena power, the power to subpoena from federal contractors and grantees, and so recipients of CARES Act money, documents that are necessary for the Inspector General to carry out this oversight. And if during the course of these audits and investigations, the Special Inspector General and his team uncover evidence that may suggest criminal wrongdoing or civil wrongdoing, then there is the statutory obligation to refer that matter to the Department of Justice for a determination whether, in fact, a prosecution or civil action is warranted. So those are traditional powers. And in addition, there are, as I say, special powers. Perhaps the most notable is a requirement in the statute, in the CARES Act, for the Special Inspector General to report to Congress, quote, without delay, close quote, when in the judgment of the Special Inspector General, information or assistance that he has requested has been, quote, unreasonably refused, close quote, or not provided. No doubt this provision was inserted into the law because, as we all have read and heard, the Trump administration has made a practice of refusing to comply with requests from not just Congress, but also inspectors general for information relevant to their oversight responsibilities. And with this provision, the presumption is that Congress, if such obstruction is reported to them, will use the various tools that they have available, appropriations power, the Senate has appointment power, or confirmation power, I should say, to try to pressure the administration into compliance. And I would just note quickly that notably, a number of Republican senators have recently written to the president to urge him to cooperate with inspectors general. So it appears that there is growing, particularly with the backdrop of so many inspector general firings and removals lately, growing bipartisan support to further empower the inspector general community. Notably, the president, in his signing statement, objected to the constitutionality of this reporting requirement that I just mentioned. The Special Inspector General has to submit his first report to Congress within 60 days of his confirmation, and then quarterly reports are due thereafter. And finally, the law provides that the Secretary of Treasury not may, but shall either take action to address any deficiencies that the IG notes in his audit reports or other reports, or the Secretary must certify to the appropriate congressional committees that no such action in his judgment is necessary or appropriate. And that's atypical, it's unusual, it's intended to persuade the Secretary not just willy-nilly to refuse to comply with the recommendations of the Inspector General. The Special Inspector General has a 5-year term and a $25 million budget. Who is the Special Inspector General? Well, as you all no doubt read, on April 3rd, the president nominated a man named Brian Miller to be the Special Inspector General. He's a former DOJ prosecutor, famously prosecuted Zacharias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker of 9/11. And notably and importantly, he is a former Inspector General himself. From 2005 to 2014, he was an appointee of President Bush. He served as the Inspector General of the General Services Administration. And in that position, he made a name for himself, a commendable one, by being an aggressive and independent Inspector General. Famously, back in 2012, as you may recall, there was a very lavish taxpayer-funded convention the GSA put on in Las Vegas, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money. And the investigation that Miller led to the resignation of a number of GSA officials, including the administrator herself. Currently, Mr. Miller serves as an associate White House counsel, 1, and 2, he played a role, albeit minor, in the impeachment inquiry by refusing information that the GAO had requested relevant to their inquiry into withholding of military aid from Ukraine. So those two facts, the fact that he is now a White House advocate for the president, and 2, that he played that role in impeachment, have led Democrats and certain independent watchdog groups to question just how independent and aggressive Mr. Miller will be if, as expected, he is confirmed. He had his confirmation hearing a couple of weeks ago before the Senate Banking Committee. The very next week, the committee reported on partisan lines his nomination favorably to the full Senate, and we're certain that he will be confirmed in short order by the full Senate. So that's the Special Inspector General. And now I'll talk quickly about the other IG mechanism called the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, or PRAC for short. PRAC is a committee of existing inspectors general and was created within an existing body, which is called CIGI, the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. It's just a consortium of the 74, 75 or so existing inspectors general. The chair of CIGI is the DOJ Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, and the law gives the chair of CIGI the authority to appoint the chair of the PRAC. As you all have probably read a few weeks back, Mr. Horowitz named Glenn Fine, the then acting Inspector General of DOD, as the chair. And then the president, on April 3rd, effectively removed Fine from that position at the PRAC by removing him as acting Inspector General of DOD. The law requires the chair of the PRAC either to be a confirmed Inspector General, ideally, or an acting one. And then you may have seen that just the other day, Mr. Fine resigned altogether from federal service. So in the interim, Mr. Horowitz has appointed himself as chair, and both an executive director and deputy executive director have been named to get the committee up and running. Its mandate is, of course, to detect waste, fraud, and abuse, as is the case for all inspectors general, but also, and uniquely, because it's a body of a number of inspectors general, the mandate is broader, and that is to mitigate major risks that cut across program and agency boundaries. the PRAC may conduct its own audits and investigations, or it may cooperate with those of individual inspectors general, including the special inspector general, and my bet is it'll do a bit of both. I won't go into much further detail, except to note a couple of special and in fact unique powers that are granted to PRAC. One is the power to compel by subpoena not just the production of documents on the part of federal grantees and contractors, which is true for inspectors general generally, as I said earlier, but also the power to compel the testimony of private actors, private entities, private people in deposition or interview-like settings. That's quite notable. And even more notable, the PRAC is given the power to compel by subpoena the testimony of such private recipients of federal money in public congressional-like hearings. So if you take CARES Act money, you can find yourself in the uncomfortable confines of an interview or deposition setting, which is uncomfortable enough, or in the Klieg lights of a congressional hearing, which is incredibly uncomfortable, as Margaret will detail, no doubt, in her presentation. The PRAC has a website that's up and running. It's called pandemic.oversight.gov. It has a list of reports that have already been produced. To Kevin's point earlier, that all these bodies, with the exception of the Special Inspector General, are to some degree up and running. A list of work that is planned, and perhaps most importantly, a form that can be used to report wrongdoing, essentially a fraud hotline. Finally, I'd say that like the Special Inspector General, the PRAC has a 5-year term, but because it's a bigger body with a wider mandate, it has a larger budget, namely $80 million. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Margaret, to talk about the congressional mechanisms.
Thanks so much, Clark. I'm going to be talking today primarily about the various congressional oversight mechanisms. And I come at that from the perspective of someone who spent more than a year on the Hill, largely conducting oversight and investigations. So the first congressional mechanism, one that was created by the new CARES Act, is the Congressional Oversight Commission. That was intended to be Congress's primary oversight tool. And it is tasked with overseeing the implementation of the CARES Act by the Department of Treasury and the Federal Reserve. The Commission is also charged with assessing the effectiveness of the CARES Act and all the other pandemic-related actions taken by Congress and federal agencies as regards the economic health of the country and the costs and benefits of those actions to the taxpayers. The Commission is intended to have a bipartisan membership chosen by the majority and minority leadership of both houses of Congress. And it is empowered to hold hearings, to take testimony, and to otherwise obtain information from any federal department or agency. It does not, however, have subpoena power. The Commission is required to submit reports to Congress every 30 days on a variety of topics, and it is funded through September 30th, 2025. The Commission to date has 4 members of its mandated 5. Those are Bharat Ramamurthy, who's a former staff member for Senator Warren, Senator Pat Toomey, Republican of Pennsylvania, Representative Donna Shalala, Democrat from Florida, and Representative French Hill, who's the Republican House nominee to the Commission. The chair must be an individual agreed to by both Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and that person has not yet been named. Despite the lack of the chair, as I believe was discussed earlier, the Commission has already issued its first report. That report was signed by all 4 members and lays out a series of questions that the Commission plans to address over the course of its mission. That report was one signal of bipartisanship by the Commission. We've also seen some disagreements among the members about what their role should be. Ramamurthy has been very active on Twitter, calling for additional transparency and accountability. Meanwhile, some of the other members have said that Representative Shalala in particular has said that she's not interested in nitpicking. and seems to be not particularly interested in engaging in aggressive oversight activity until there's a chairman. Senator Toomey and Mr. Ramamurthy have already disagreed about whether loan recipients should be permitted to grant bonuses, among other topics. So at this point, we have seen some activity from them, some disagreement, and I think at this point, what we can say about them is that they will be active. We don't necessarily know how yet. Moving on to the next slide. There's also additional oversight mechanisms that we'll be looking into CARES Act funding. First, there is a new investigative subcommittee of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. That subcommittee is chaired by Majority Whip Jim Clyburn. It has subpoena power and it has a very broad mandate to examine any issues related to the coronavirus crisis. Based on public statements from both Speaker Pelosi and Representative Clyburn, this subcommittee will have a strong focus on the private sector. Speaker Pelosi has said that the subcommittee will be laser focused on ensuring that taxpayer money goes to workers' paychecks and benefits. And it will ensure that the federal response is based on the best possible science, guided by health experts, and that the money invested is not being exploited by profiteers and price gougers. Representative Clyburn has said that the subcommittee is going to be looking at whether or not the money that's appropriated will go to support the people who've been affected, or whether or not this money will end up in the pockets of a few profiteers. Now, the subcommittee has actually already begun sending letters and holding hearings. In their first official action, they sent letters to 5 publicly traded corporations demanding that those corporations return their PPP funds. They've also now held 3 hearings focusing their attention on how to safely reopen the economy, frontline workers, and we'll be holding a hearing next week featuring mayors who will be discussing the need for more federal support. There are also multiple other standing congressional committees, not to mention individual members, who will also be conducting oversight related to the coronavirus, and in some cases, but in both the House and the Senate, have already begun holding hearings. We should expect to see oversight related to both the public and private sector activity from every congressional committee. GAO, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, has also already begun its work and has received millions of dollars to focus its auditors, investigators, and other experts on conducting reviews related to the pandemic. Clark?
Thank you, Margaret. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are also 74 to be precise, I think, pre-existing offices of Inspector General. And collectively, they have been given additional money, approximately $140 million in total, to carry out COVID-19 related oversight activities of their own, separate and apart from those of the Special Inspector General and of the PRAC. And these IGs are already hard at work, just like the congressional bodies that Margaret just talked about are already hard at work. Just to cite a few examples, the SBA IG, which along with Treasury, of course, administers the PPP program, is auditing that program and says, the IG of the SBA says that he has dozens of criminal fraud investigations underway, and he's working closely with DOJ in that regard. The HHS IG was on the Hill a couple of days ago, and she said that she has updated her audit work plan for 2020 to include an audit of the Provider Relief Fund program that provides coronavirus-related money to hospitals to defray expenses from COVID-19 related treatment and also lost revenue. And the Treasury IG is auditing the Air Carrier Worker Support Program that provides money to passenger airlines, cargo airlines, and their contractors to enable them to keep paying the wages, salaries, and benefits of their workers. Margaret?
We're also seeing, as we often do in oversight, that the congressional mechanisms and the IG oversight mechanisms are going to be working together very closely. As Clark just mentioned, you saw the HHSIG testifying on the Hill to provide an update about work. So that provides the IG with a forum to talk about their oversight. It also allows the members to ask pointed questions. And as we've seen in other crises, we're also seeing a number of requests from members to the IGs to investigate a wide range of topics that Congress may not be able or willing to investigate themselves. Kevin?
Thanks, Margaret. So the new oversight bodies and mechanisms that Clark and Margaret have just described don't replace and don't even supplant the existing regulatory and enforcement agencies that predated the pandemic. So as a result, individual organizations are going to be subject to multiple layers of oversight. And as you can imagine, this will not all be well coordinated or conducted on similar timelines or to similar standards. And so critically, organizations' underlying legal and regulatory obligations continue largely unabated. While there have been some pronouncements by federal agencies that they plan to take the current environment into account or to be flexible in their application of existing regulations, those regulations still exist. For example, banks still must comply with the Bank Secrecy Act, and public companies still have SEC reporting obligations. For many organizations, particularly those in highly regulated industries, their regulators may be the first and most frequent touch point regarding how they received and utilized coronavirus-related funds. Many of those regulators will have access to detailed information regarding the use of funds and can refer issues that they identify to other regulatory or enforcement counterparts. Additionally, other federal agencies like the Treasury Department, SBA, SEC, and GAO, as we've highlighted elsewhere, are already looking into how organizations have applied for, are using, and are disclosing their need for and use of the funds. As Margaret touched on, the CARES Act directed the GAO to study the loans, loan guarantees, and other investments under Section 4003 of the CARES Act, and importantly, appropriated an additional $20 million in funding to the GAO to carry out that and other related oversight activities. We've also already seen private litigants file suit to start that process. They filed suit, for instance, against banks for allegedly preferential treatment in the processing of PPP loan applications. And really, as just one early reminder, but maybe the first reminder of the feedback loop that's at play here between all of these various mechanisms that are out there, those lawsuits very quickly triggered letters from Senator Rubio to the banks that were sued, as well as other banks and large SBA lenders requesting information regarding their loan application processing. Moreover, while DOJ to date has prioritized the investigation and prosecution of coronavirus-related scams, such as seeking payment for non-existent treatment or equipment, investment scams, work from home scams, they've also reached out to most of the largest PPP lenders to try to identify individuals and companies that may have committed fraud on their PPP applications, including by lender shopping. And we've seen the charges have started to come out and be filed and publicized that are stemming from these investigations. While that initial outreach from DOJ to lenders has been largely non-adversarial, banks should be wary as these initial discussions may evolve and the focus may begin to turn to the bank's conduct and away from just potential borrower misconduct. DOJ will continue to investigate the conduct of organizations that receive federal funding, either based on their own investigative work or via referrals from other agencies or even from False Claims Act cases initiated by private litigants. We think it's almost certain that there will be a spike in False Claims Act cases regarding certifications made to obtain funds, as well as how those funds were ultimately spent and whether the conditions of the various programs were met by the recipients. Given the unprecedented amount of federal funds that are being dispersed at such a record pace, there inevitably will be representations that turn out to be untrue, and the treble damages that are available under the False Claims Act will provide significant incentive for DOJ and private litigants to pursue those cases. Clark?
Thank you, Kevin. So in crafting the new oversight mechanisms that Margaret and I talked about, the framers in the Congress looked at history and looked at the oversight mechanisms that were set up a decade ago, the last time we faced an economic crisis, albeit one that, though obviously severe, was not as severe as this one. Hundreds of billions of dollars injected there, trillions of dollars injected here. But we can look to how the Special Inspector General for TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program of a decade ago, did its work. By the way, that body continues as an indicator of how aggressive the Special Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery might be. Just to give you a couple of examples, with SIGTARP, which, as I say, continues to this day, the Special Inspector General for TARP, one of the many companies back then that took TARP funds early on was General Motors. During the course of the Special IG's investigation of the use of the funds by GM, the SIGTARP discovered that there was an ignition switch problem and that GM had failed to issue a timely recall. This finding resulted in a whopping $900 million fine, changes in recall practices, not just at GM, but industry-wide, but most importantly, criminal charges and a criminal conviction. And an even starker example is the fact that the very first criminal investigation that SIGTARP initiated was of a Ponzi schemer who merely claimed to be buying and selling TARP guaranteed debt. He actually never bought any such debt, so he couldn't sell it. But just the fact that he was claiming to was enough of a predicate for the SIGTARP to go after him. And he was convicted and is serving a 10-year term on account of that. To date, SIGTARP has recovered $11 billion in misspent funds. It's obtained nearly 400 criminal convictions, including that of 70 bankers. So, as I said earlier, the jury is out on just how aggressive Mr. Miller will be, but if he uses the model of SIGTARP as a template, he can be very aggressive indeed, and that should be worrisome to our clients. Margaret?
So TARP is also a model for the Congressional Oversight Commission I was discussing earlier. That's modeled on the Congressional Oversight Panel under the leadership of now Senator Elizabeth Warren. The Congressional Oversight Panel aggressively questioned the actions of recipients of TARP funds and also the effectiveness of the funds in bolstering the economic health of the country. It's generally considered now that the panel greatly contributed to the national conversation on the effectiveness of TARP, and its work was also seen as a primary driver of the resulting Dodd-Frank legislation, which is one of the most consequential financial regulations in American history. Clark?
So the other Inspector General body that I mentioned, the PRAC, was modeled on the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board that was set up in 2009 as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. That board was created to oversee the distribution of those funds. In addition to a chairman who was appointed by the president, the board consisted of the inspectors general of all the departments and agencies that receive funds from that act, similar to, as I say, the committee in the CARES Act. Unlike the SIGTARP, the board did not become a law enforcement agency. Rather, it focused rather heavily on tracking the flow of funds. It had a 6-year tenure, and during that tenure, the board recommended ways in which some $8 billion could be put to better use. It questioned costs totaling $5 billion, and it played a role in nearly 3,200 audits, inspections, and other reviews and probes by inspectors general, resulting in more than 1,600 convictions, pleas, and judgments, and more than $160 million in recoveries, forfeitures, seizures, and estimated savings. And to continue briefly on the theme of lessons learned, we all will remember, of course, Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. Back then, at least $7 billion was appropriated to a number of agencies to deal with the hurricane's aftermath, mostly DOD, the Army Corps of Engineers, and FEMA. Some 13 offices of Inspector General staffed up to look into how their respective agencies and those agencies' grantees and contractors were spending the money. And they used some 300 auditors and investigators and examiners to do that. And my old office, the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, even set up a special unit within the office to focus just on Katrina. The scrutiny was vigorous and long-lasting. To give you just one example, for years, the DHS-OIG tried to claw back the $2 billion that had been appropriated to the city of New Orleans, claiming after the fact that the damage done to the road and water system there predated the storm. New Orleans ultimately prevailed, but the fight between the city and OIG lasted for years. I think it concluded literally just a couple of years ago. Margaret?
Now, Hurricane Katrina is also an excellent example of how you saw multiple entities engaging in concurrent oversight and investigations. You had the inspectors general, there were multiple House and Senate investigations, and civil, criminal, and administrative actions. These were often overlapping and in some cases duplicative, and they too lasted for years. I'll also note in this context that whenever you have the different political parties engaging in oversight, you have the potential for those activities to be driven by and or used for different political purposes. This can include IG audits that are requested by members of Congress for their specific political goals, or the same being pushed by political appointees in the administration for their purposes. Even work that is conducted by a nonpartisan entity, for example, GAO, will be subject to partisan interpretation and may be weaponized. And this is just something to be aware of as these multiple oversight activities are ongoing. Kevin?
Thanks, Margaret. Before stepping through specific steps that your organizations can take, we thought it might be helpful to take just maybe a half step back for a second to discuss some of the fundamental principles that should guide the processes and controls that you or your clients can put into place to help insulate organizations from the coming post hoc review of their actions. And to do so, it's important to think of the lens through which those actions are going to be viewed. And I think really sort of the two most fundamental touchstones here are reasonableness and good faith. In other words, are the actions that are being taken, and even importantly, those actions that are not being taken, are they reasonable? And is the organization evaluating its various courses of action in good faith? And that's important for a number of reasons. There is going to be second guessing here, and any organization that receives these funds just needs to plan on that happening. And as a result, they need to make the best good faith decision that they can based on all of the information available to them at the time. And I think one of the things we see here too is that while speed is important, it's not and can't be paramount. It is important to take the time to understand the issue when making these decisions. And that's because this decision making needs to be based on the most accurate and frankly up-to-date information possible. One example of where this can trip folks up is in the PPP context, where seemingly the interim final rules and the FAQs change on an almost daily basis. And while they're colored as, just clarifications, they often supersede previous guidance that was out there. And getting it right takes effort. Assuming that it will work out in the end because there is a quote unquote new normal because of the pandemic really is courting problems. Take the time to work through the compliance requirements and the issues, and I think that will serve you and your clients very well down the road. So just some examples of that, again, at a higher level. Are there pre-existing controls in place that will allow the organization to adequately control and trace the use of funds? If not, are you taking steps to improve your ability to do so? One sort of concrete example of that is that some programs, like the payroll support program, which is the one for airline and air carriers and related contractors, under certain circumstances, it requires that recipients set up a segregated account to receive the funds. But we've seen that even where that's not mandated, companies are taking that step and segregating those funds on their own as a way of sort of bolstering their existing accounting controls that are already in place. Another one is, are you thinking through the organization's particular risk profile and making reasonable efforts to ensure that compliance resources are deployed consistent with the organization's risk assessment? If an issue or a shortcoming is identified through the controls that you have in place, is the organization addressing it head on, or is it being ignored with a hope that it will go away or not be detected? With all the scrutiny that's there, an oversight body finding that an issue was ignored in the hopes that it would go away is just going to lead to more digging and further scrutiny. And then, is there a process in place to monitor guidance to ensure that the organization is staying up to date on the rules, regulations, and even the sort of media and political environment surrounding any programs that the organization is participating in, to make sure that it is adapting to changes either in the rules themselves or in these other outside factors that really can impact the risk calculus regarding participation in the program? We've mentioned the PPP a lot here, but in just that one program, the SBA has issued 48 FAQs and 15 interim final rules. And so it's imperative to stay attuned to the programs that you're participating in, even after funds are received. And two other smaller points, and this one probably seems obvious or even trite, but is the organization just exercising common sense? Because if something doesn't feel right, you should at least stop and get a second opinion. If not, just don't do it. Some of the issues that we are seeing play out in the news that have created some of this backlash could have been avoided, and frankly, for a number of companies, were avoided by exercising common sense. And then finally, on this, if you need help or your clients need help, they should be coming to you. They should be getting that help. And importantly, many of these programs, such as FEMA funds, as well as state and local coronavirus relief funds, permit the monies to be used in part to help the recipients to oversee their implementation and use of COVID-related expenditures.
So thank you, Kevin. I'll just add a little bit to what you said without being duplicative, but as Kevin said, and it bears repeating, it's important not just to ensure that you meet the criteria, the letter of the criteria for relief, but also, do you meet the spirit of it? We've talked a lot already, of course, about the PPP, but just to talk about a couple of other programs that make this point. You all read the news a few weeks ago about the monies that Harvard and Stanford and other elite universities like that were allocated under the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. In those instances, that fund was just allocated on the basis of formula, largely based on the percentage of students dependent on financial aid there. So it's not like those schools applied, but because of the political pressure, in Harvard's case, it had a $40 billion endowment. I think it had a $300 million surplus last year. The question is that the intent of the CARES Act, particularly in these very, very tight, unprecedented economic times with depression-level employment? Another example, you may have seen the New York Times story on Monday regarding the Provider Relief Fund for hospitals. And there, one of the hospitals that was specifically named was Providence. They got $500 million from the Provider Relief Fund to defray lost revenue and also to take care of expenses that hadn't been budgeted for as a result of COVID-19. So they got $500 million, but at the same time, they were sitting on $12 billion in cash. They have a venture capital arm that last year had a profit of $1.3 billion, so much more than the revenue they earned from being a hospital, and their CEO was being paid $10 million. So these are the kind of factors that, of course, in this highly politicized environment will lead eventually to scrutiny by Congress, by inspectors general, even though strictly speaking, these entities were arguably at least were entitled to the money under those two programs. So you have to view these things through a political lens. And I'd also add, to the extent clients use vendors, third-party vendors, they should ensure that they've done diligence over those vendors and that they have used open and competitive contracting. And among the controls that should be in place, Kevin talked about controls, is an audit trail to be able to show, if you have to, if an auditor or investigator comes knocking, that you can prove that every dollar was spent according to the terms of the law and otherwise in accordance with applicable regulations. And it might help in that regard, if possible, to designate one person, supported by a team if necessary, to be responsible for understanding what the rules are that continue to change, as Kevin said, and also for making sure that the funds are tracked and can be fully accounted for. Kevin?
Thanks, Clark. I think one thing, and we've mentioned this a little bit, but just I think it's key as we're looking at this oversight and scrutiny piece is, hopefully, knocking on wood, the health crisis and the economic impact of it will, will subside and things will, get back to normal at some point in the hopefully not too distant future. But the scrutiny of how these funds are used is going to continue for years, and it's going to persist past, this current emergency and past several national elections. As you heard Clark and Margaret describe, many of these bodies have 5-year terms. I think the SBA review process has a 6-year statute of limitations. And then you've got all these other bodies that are just out there and aren't going anyway. And so while the urgency to react quickly and to push out money at a record pace is there now, it's going to subside. And the government is going to use 20/20 hindsight to review these programs and how recipients of the funds got the money, used the money, reported their use of the money. And so we've already seen how public perception has altered the implementation of the PPP program, just in this short window already, based on, media reports and other backlash regarding how the program was designed and implemented. Nowhere was that more apparent than in the reactions to loans received by larger hotels and restaurants. And I think critically, and Clark talked about this in the higher education context and the healthcare provider context, the law was written specifically to allow these folks to get that money, but because of this backlash, the goalposts have been moved, and there's a renewed skepticism regarding loans to all types of multi-location, multi-entity organizations, including nursing homes, auto dealers, franchises, et cetera, who are getting pulled into this. And in talking about sort of how this is going to change, one of the cornerstones of the PPP program has been that the banks can rely on borrower certifications, but we've begun to see some cracks in that as well, as Secretary Mnuchin has raised questions about bank actions in providing those loans to large public companies. And so in an interview several weeks ago, Mr. Mnuchin acknowledged that the law was clear that it was the borrowers, not the banks, who faced criminal liability for making certifications that weren't true. He did go on to say, quote, "Do I think some of these banks from a reputational standpoint should have looked at some of these companies and said, is this the right thing to do? Yeah, I think they probably should have done that." And so Treasury may not have much recourse against the banks, under the way that the law is drafted. Those are exactly the type of issues that spawn congressional investigations and private litigation and reputational harm that comes along with those. Clark touched on healthcare providers a little bit. One of the things that folks have put a lot of stock in is the CMS administrator's statement that the funds being provided to healthcare providers have no strings attached. With federal money, there is no such thing as no strings attached. It may truly be the intention of government officials now at the height of the pandemic to provide this money with as few strings attached as possible. As the crisis recedes, they're going to examine how the funds were spent and look to hold organizations accountable through regulatory, civil, criminal, or congressional processes. And I think this New York Times article that Clark mentioned that came out on Monday could be sort of the opening salvo in that movement in the healthcare space. And so because these programs and the sentiment regarding them can and likely will change on a dime, it's critical to stay informed of the developments so that an organization can respond promptly to those changes. And that's another reason why if fund recipients catch something after the fact, it's important to course correct. Even if it feels like it's too late, it's never too late to make that adjustment. If you address the issue, take steps to make sure it doesn't recur, and then monitor that it isn't recurring, that is going to stand your client or any organization in good stead as this scrutiny comes along. That requires, paying particular attention to the requirements of the programs that are involved. If funds have to be expended by a certain date or can only be used for expenses during a particular time period, it's important to make sure that that's being tracked and that there are controls in place to enforce those limitations. We have worked over the last couple of months with a number of clients participating in or facilitating these different programs. And while those clients come in many shapes and sizes and have very different risk profiles and even risk tolerances, we've seen a couple of responses that I think we'd characterize as best practices. And first, in the immediacy of some of these crises, it's unlikely that all of an organization's pre-existing review, approval, committee mechanisms will be able to respond rapidly enough for some of the decisions that need to be made. Nonetheless, it's important to make sure that decisions are made in as deliberative of a manner as is possible under the time constraints, and that those decisions are documented and then disseminated. So we've got a number of clients who aren't using their risk committees in the way they're normally constituted because those decisions would take too long. Instead, they've created a response team that consists of representatives from risk, legal, the business lines, and compliance who can handle those many fast-moving decisions. And then as time permits, they go back, they document those decisions, and then they distribute them to their frontline personnel so that the organization is effectively and importantly consistently implementing the decisions that have been made. And that's one of the key areas where it's easy to trip up and draw scrutiny is if similarly apparent or seemingly similarly situated people or organizations aren't treated similarly, and that's why this dissemination and consistency are so important. Second, it's unlikely that organizations will have time to conduct full-scale training. Nonetheless, as an organization begins participating in or utilizing a particular program or set of funds, it's important that the front line understands the requirements and their roles. And then as experience with and expertise in the program increases or even the guidance changes, important to make sure that those changes or those best practices that have been developed are disseminated to those personnel in your organization that will need to act on it. From a due diligence standpoint, Clark mentioned vetting third parties, so I won't dwell on it too much. Just to say, in addition to the compliance challenges that are inherent in just the everyday receipt of federal funds, the disruption caused by the global pandemic has wreaked havoc on global supply chains. And as a result, federal funds recipients must pay particular attention to the counterparties that they are transacting with, as well as the suppliers of those customers or end users. And if you receive funds from the federal government, you're likely going to be responsible for how any subcontractors or subgrantees utilize the funds. And in fact, several weeks ago on a call with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the Treasury Department went out of their way to emphasize that caution to make sure that people were tracking it. Finally, are there strong cybersecurity policies, controls, and training in place? We know and we've all read about, a big upswing in COVID-related phishing scams and can anticipate that ransomware attacks and hacking will be issues now and going forward for recipients of federal funds. As Clark discussed with regard to SIGTARP, shortcomings by recipients of federal funds, even if only tangentially related to the receipt of federal funding, are likely to open them to significant scrutiny. Companies that receive large amounts of federal funds are targets for cybersecurity attacks, and any shortcomings in their systems, controls, or even their response to any incident could subject them to significant scrutiny. Margaret?
So I'm just going to talk quickly for a minute about a few special considerations for private entities who are taking CARES Act funds. As Kevin mentioned, CARES Act requirements and then the requirements and reporting will layer on top of existing obligations for highly regulated industries. So we would recommend that entities that take money should make sure that all of their policies and procedures are well scrubbed, since attention based on behavior during the coronavirus crisis may end up opening the rest of their operations to scrutiny, as in the example that Clark mentioned about Ford. Also say that entities or sectors that are frequently the subject of audits or investigations or political scrutiny should expect more. If you are already used to being the subject of scrutiny by a federal government entity, all of the people who were previously turning their focus onto you will now just have an additional reason to do so in the CARES Act funding. For example, members of Congress have already called out the for-profit college industry for accepting CARES Act funding, and have called for them to not receive any future funding. And that's just an example of the way that they are using this as part of their already existing oversight focus. Kevin and Clark have also both talked about how the goalposts have shifted for entities who have followed the letter of the law in taking PPP funds or lenders, healthcare companies, higher education, and how those entities have found them under scrutiny. So I won't belabor that point, but I will just say that as a former congressional investigator, this sort of thing was specifically where we focused. It's what we call legal but dumb activity. And so even if you're following the letter of the law, it's worth applying the lens of public scrutiny to decisions, not just with CARES Act money, but also across the entity, since careless or thoughtless actions anywhere in the business, if they attract public scrutiny, may draw the attention of the entities who are interested in doing oversight of CARES Act funding, and thus result in an audit or investigation. And those political risks can come from all sides, whether that is investigation by the House Democrats or Senate Republicans, or a tweet from the president. I should also just flag that any entity that attracts scrutiny should also be prepared to have their political and lobbying spending scrutinized, since that will often become part of the public story. And for any entity that is getting a sufficient amount of money and or feels sufficiently at risk, if you don't already have a relationship with a public relations communications firm, it's worth considering getting one established now, so that if you need somebody to call, you have them. Similarly, it's worth considering whether to have some sort of relationship in place with a governmental affairs or lobbying professional to ensure that your entity has the ability to access those kinds of relationships if necessary, just because they may be helpful in the event of scrutiny. Clark?
Thank you, Margaret. And I'm mindful of time. We're at 4:32, but let me just take literally 2 minutes or less to talk just quickly about things that are particular to public entities, because we noticed that among the registrants are some representatives of governments, presumably municipal governments and or state governments, and there are certain things that are unique to such entities. First, I'd say that partisan differences and ideological differences over how much federal financial support should go to states and localities as a whole, and to certain states and localities in particular because of their partisan or ideological makeup, is likely to prompt particular scrutiny over aid to those kinds of public entities. For example, the president just a few weeks ago said, quote, "Why should the people and taxpayers of America be bailing out poorly run states like Illinois, for example, and cities in all Democrat run and managed places when most of the other states are not looking for bailout help?" So that's just one example of that point. A second and similar point is partisan differences over hot button social or political issues like immigration or guns or abortion or climate change can also prompt partisan scrutiny over how cities and states are using coronavirus related funds and whether they're entitled to them in the first place. To just cite another presidential quote on this point, he said a couple of weeks ago, "I don't see helping cities and states if they're going to be sanctuary," meaning sanctuary cities with regard to undocumented immigrants. Third, given the virtually unlimited need for relief funds and the mounting costs of aid provided to date, and which continues to run up our deficit and our debt, it'll be important for these public entities to show that there were no other sources of funding available that could have been tapped, except for the coronavirus-related funds that have been appropriated by the Congress. And the corollary there is no double dipping, which we have already emphasized that Leah did in her presentation. And then four, this is not unique to public entities, but it bears emphasizing that once the proverbial Pandora's box is open, there's no telling what can come out. So an audit or investigation over the use of coronavirus-related funds could uncover problems in other areas. So it behooves public entities, to the extent possible, to get their proverbial house in order with respect to compliance with all other applicable laws and regulations. And then finally, and this is a corollary, if you, meaning public entity X or Y, if you've already been in the crosshairs of federal regulators or investigators and our law enforcement authorities for other things, then chances are higher that you may be scrutinized over your receipt and use of coronavirus-related funds.
Thanks, Clark, and thanks all of you. This is Kevin again, and just to wrap up, we'd like to thank you for attending the webinar and hope that it was helpful. Since we've run over our allotted time, we will make sure to follow up and to address the questions that we've received, separately and individually after we hang up today. And I guess the last thing I would say, again, mindful of our time, is if I could summarize one key takeaway for how we recommend organizations approach the various coronavirus related federal programs, it would be the tried and true adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that applies to applying for the funds, receiving and using the funds, reporting on how the funds are used, as Margaret said, sort of preparing for scrutiny that might come, having a PR firm ready to go if it looks like your organization is going to be subject to scrutiny. And while there's no guarantee that taking preventative measures now will result in no oversight scrutiny, it does guarantee that you will be better positioned to respond to that oversight and to mitigate its impact on your organization if and when it does come. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.
Legal but dumb. For me, Margaret, that was the phrase of the afternoon, so I'm hoping with your permission we can borrow from that liberally. Again, on behalf of the criminal law section, thank you to our presenters for your time and your talent, from Squire Patton Boggs, for being with us today. Thanks also to Melissa Green and Kerry Lee, the business development managers from the firm, and my colleague Rebecca Poston, who really was the key figure who got all of this rolling. And thanks to you as well. There were over 80 of you who were involved in today's CLE. Thank you for joining us. We hope it was helpful, both in how to obtain these federal funds and for doing our best to stay out of harm's way, as cases, civil and criminal, for sure, will be prosecuted and need to be defended down the road. Our course number 3974, Jenny will be sending out the email. The email will include the link to where you can watch this video again. It'll include the accreditation certificate for your CLE. If you didn't get any of the articles that our presenters wanted you to read up on before the event, please email Jenny and let her know. And this PowerPoint that our presenters have created will be included in the email to you. So I don't know if you were taking screenshots all along, but no need. We will email you the PowerPoint. And as Kevin said, any of you who sent in questions, the panel will be happy to get back to you in short order. A quick word about some criminal law section CLE on the horizon. Next Thursday, June 4th at noon, our chair of the section, Jennifer Zadalis, will be presenting the first installment in our Experts on Advocacy series. It's called The Storyboard, Putting Your Case Together for the Courtroom. Jennifer is the Director of Trial Practice at UF Law School. It's a great one. A lot of people are signing up already. It's not one we want you to miss. Later on in June, changes in the state criminal justice landscape in light of the virus. We're going to do 3 of those, dividing Florida into southern, northern, and sort of northwestern and western. The state attorneys, the public defenders, and the regional counsel from all over the state are going to be involved, explain what's going on in their jurisdictions, and answer all of your questions about all your concerns for what's going on in your jurisdiction. Dates and times for those are to come, as well as part 2 of our attorney wellness series. Dr. Weinstein, the clinical psychologist and clinical director for FLA, he's going to check back in with us towards the end of June to see how we're doing. And soon up on our website, we will have our Rule 3.113 Discovery Brady Giglio Compliance CLE, brand new, just recorded from Dennis DeVlaming out of Clearwater. So we hope you'll take advantage of that as well. And of course, our live events, knock on wood, are scheduled to begin in October and continue through November and December in Miami and Orlando. Join us. If you're a member, get more involved. If you're not a member yet, only $25. Look around the world. Look around America. This past week alone, today alone, has there ever been a more compelling time for you to make your voice heard, to make substantial positive change in the world around you, right? By day's end, to be doing better, to do more good than harm. FloridaBarCLS.org is where you will find us, remembering that how a society treats one another, its outcasts in particular, says perhaps the most about the type of society that we are and are destined to become. Thanks for joining us today. Keep on keeping safe. We'll see you soon.